The wind came down from the mountains on the 3rd of December in the year 1887, and it came with the voice of something that meant to kill. The thermometer outside Harrigan's Mercantile read 4 degrees above zero at dawn, but by noon the mercury had plunged below the lowest mark, and the glass itself cracked from the cold before sunset. Deerfield, Montana, population 847 souls, had weathered hard winters before. The old-timers spoke of the blizzard of '73, when snow buried the hitching posts and a man could walk across drifts level with the false fronts of Main Street. But those who stood at their windows that December morning, watching the sky turn the color of hammered lead, felt something different in their bones. This was not a storm that would pass. This was a siege. The first gusts stripped a shingle from the roof of the Jessup Hotel and sent it spinning into the thoroughfare like a playing card thrown by a giant's hand. The wooden buildings that lined Main Street, structures that had seemed so solid and permanent through 3 seasons of prosperity, began to creak and groan against the assault. Heat bled from every gap in every wall, from every poorly fitted window frame, from every threshold where daylight showed beneath warped doors. The citizens of Deerfield did not know it yet, but they were about to learn that their town had been built for summer, not for the killing cold that was descending upon them with the patience of a predator that knows its prey cannot run. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1884, a man named Sawyer Wainwright had ridden into Deerfield on a strawberry-roan mare he called Moira, after the grandmother whose hands had taught him everything he knew about surviving cold that could stop a heart between one breath and the next. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of working iron, with eyes the color of winter slate and a manner of speaking that marked him immediately as foreign. The Scottish burr in his voice drew curious stares and the occasional muttered comment about Highlanders and their strange ways. He paid these no mind. He had not come to Deerfield to make friends. Sawyer had come because he recognized the land. The Montana plains stretched flat and exposed to the north, with nothing between the town and the Canadian border but grass and sky, and the accumulated fury of Arctic winds that had been building strength since the ice caps formed. The mountains rose to the west and south, funneling those winds into the valley where Deerfield sat like a rabbit in an open field. Sawyer had seen country like this before. The Scottish Highlands could be deceptively gentle in summer, all purple heather and soft mists, but winter transformed them into a landscape that killed the careless and the proud with equal indifference. His grandmother Moira had understood this. She had been born in a stone cottage on the Isle of Skye, where the wind came off the sea with salt on its breath and ice in its heart. Her father and his father before him had built their shelters into the hillsides, using the living rock as a wall against the cold. They had learned, through generations of bitter experience, that wood was a summer material. Stone endured. Stone held heat. Stone did not crack and splinter when the temperature dropped past the point where iron became brittle and leather turned to boards. But it was the ropes that Sawyer remembered most clearly. Moira had taught him about lifelines before he was old enough to understand why they mattered. In the worst storms, she explained, a man could lose his way walking from his house to his barn. The snow came down so thick that he could not see his own hands in front of his face. The wind howled so loud that he could not hear himself scream. And the cold worked on his mind, making him confused, making him turn in circles, making him lie down in the snow to rest for just a moment, just until the storm passed. Those men never rose again. So the crofters tied ropes. They strung lines between every building, every well, every haystack and woodpile and privy. They tied the ropes at waist height, because a man staggering blind through a blizzard might miss a line at his feet or above his head, but he would not miss a rope that struck him across the belly. They taught their children to never release one line until they had grasped another, to move hand over hand through the howling whiteness, trusting the rope when they could trust nothing else. Sawyer had been 14 years old when the storm came that took his grandmother from him. They had been traveling to America, crossing the Atlantic in the hold of a ship called the Caledonia, when an early winter gale caught them 3 days out from New York Harbor. The ship had pitched and rolled, and passengers had been thrown from their berths, and Moira had tied a rope around Sawyer's wrist and then around her own, because she had survived too many storms to trust fate now. The wave that broke through the hatch had been cold enough to stop breath. Sawyer remembered the water hitting him like a fist made of ice, remembered being swept off his feet and tumbled through darkness, remembered the rope burning his wrist as it pulled taut. When he finally found his footing, gasping and blind with salt water, he had followed that rope hand over hand back to his grandmother. She was dead. Her heart had stopped, the ship's doctor said later from the shock of the cold. But her frozen hands were still wrapped around the rope, still holding on, still fulfilling the promise she had made him. She had kept him safe, even in the moment of her own death. Sawyer buried her at sea, as the ship's captain insisted. He kept the rope. He would keep it until the day he died. When he arrived in Deerfield 3 years before the storm, leading Moira through streets that seemed too wide and too exposed, he had known immediately that this town was not ready for a real winter. The buildings were timber-framed and timber-sided with gaps in the siding that whistled in any breeze. The roofs were pitched for rain, not for the crushing weight of heavy snow. The people built their fires large and burned through their wood stores quickly, because no one had taught them that small, steady heat lasted longer than roaring blaze. They were summer people living in a winter land, and they did not know it yet. He had chosen his ground carefully. East of town, perhaps half a mile from the last house, a granite outcropping rose from the prairie like the spine of some ancient beast buried beneath the soil. The rock was gray and solid and unlovely, worthless for farming, too hard to quarry profitably, dismissed by every settler who had looked at it as an obstacle rather than an opportunity. The land around it had been claimed and abandoned twice before Sawyer rode out to examine it. He stood at the base of that granite face for a long time, Moira cropping grass behind him, her breath steaming in the cool spring air. He pressed his palm against the stone and felt the steady temperature within, neither warm nor cold, simply constant. His grandmother had described such rock. She had said that the old people of Skye had built their winter shelters into stone faces just like this one, because the earth itself became their hearth. The rock absorbed heat in summer and released it slowly through winter. A chamber carved into living granite would hold warmth when every wooden building in the territory was bleeding heat into the hungry air. Sawyer filed his claim that same day. The work began in May of that year and continued for 6,000 hours spread across 26 months. He purchased hand drills from a mining supply company in Helena, paying $11 for a set of star drills in graduated sizes, and another $8 for a sledgehammer heavy enough to drive them. Black powder cost him $120 over the course of the project, purchased in careful quantities so as not to alarm the territorial authorities. He bought fuse, blasting caps, a surveyor's level, and 200 feet of good hemp rope. The technique he used had been taught to him by Cornish miners passing through Helena, men who knew stone the way Sawyer knew iron. They showed him how to drill blast holes in a pattern that would fracture the rock along predictable lines. They taught him to read the grain of the granite, to find the natural fissures and work with them rather than against them. One of them, an old man named Traylor, who had lost 3 fingers to a misfire in his youth, warned him that stone was patient and would punish impatience. Sawyer did not hurry. He drilled each hole by hand, turning the star bit a quarter rotation between each hammer blow, clearing the dust with a long copper spoon. Some holes took a full day to complete. The deepest holes, the ones that would break the back of the main chamber, required 3 days each. He packed the charges carefully, tamped them with clay, and retreated to a safe distance before touching the fuse with a slow match. The explosions echoed across the prairie, and the people of Deerfield looked up from their work and shook their heads. By the end of the first year, he had excavated 15 feet into the granite face, creating a rough chamber 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall. The walls were jagged and unfinished, scarred with blast marks and chisel cuts, but the space was beginning to take shape. He could stand at the back of the chamber and feel the steady coolness of the rock around him, smell the mineral scent of freshly broken stone, hear the way sounds softened and died against surfaces that had never known air before. The second year was slower. He worked alone, refusing offers of help from curious miners and skeptical farmers alike. He smoothed the walls with hammer and chisel, squaring the corners, leveling the floor. He discovered a natural fissure running upward through the rock at a steep angle, and he widened it carefully until it formed a chimney that would draw smoke from his forge and vent it to the open air 40 feet above. He built a vestibule at the entrance, an L-shaped passage of stacked stone that would break the force of any wind and prevent snow from drifting directly into his workspace. By the autumn of 1886, the cave workshop was complete. 40 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with a forge built against the back wall, a coal bin that would hold 4 tons, and a living space along the southern wall where he could sleep and cook and wait out any storm that the Montana winter chose to send. The granite held steady at 52 degrees year-round, cool enough to require a fire for comfort, but warm enough that water would never freeze. He had spent $340 on tools and explosives, countless hours of labor that no one would ever pay him for, and he had built something that would outlast every wooden building in Deerfield by centuries. The citizens of Deerfield thought he was mad. The citizens of Deerfield thought he was mad, and they were not quiet about saying so. Mayor Thaddeus Jessup was the first to give voice to what others only muttered behind their hands. Jessup was a large man, prosperous and proud of it, with a belly that spoke of good eating and a voice that carried across any room he chose to dominate. He had built the Jessup Hotel with his own money and his own ambition, a 3-story wooden structure with a false front that made it appear even taller, and he considered himself the leading citizen of Deerfield in all matters of commerce and common sense. When he rode past Sawyer's granite outcropping that first autumn, watching the Scottish blacksmith emerge from his cave covered in rock dust and blasting residue, Jessup had laughed loud enough to spook his horse. The nickname came later at the Independence Day gathering of 1886, when the entire town assembled on the grounds behind the Methodist Church for speeches and pie and the collective celebration of American prosperity. Sawyer had not been invited to speak, though he had been in Deerfield long enough to qualify as a citizen, and he stood at the edge of the crowd with his arms crossed and his winter-slate eyes watching everything and revealing nothing. Jessup took the podium after the territorial representative had finished his remarks about statehood and progress. The mayor mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief, though the day was not particularly warm, and launched into a speech about the bright future of Deerfield and the industrious character of its people. He spoke of the new mercantile expansion, of the telegraph line that would reach them by spring, of the railroad spur that was surely only a few years away, and then, with the timing of a man who knew exactly how to work a crowd, he paused and pointed toward the eastern horizon. "Of course," Jessup said, his voice carrying across the assembled families and farmers and merchants, "not all of our citizens share the American spirit of progress. Some prefer to burrow into the ground like moles, hiding from honest daylight in caves of their own making." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward Sawyer, who stood motionless at the edge of the gathering. "I have seen the work our Scottish friend is doing out there on that worthless rock," Jessup continued, warming to his theme, "blasting and digging and crawling around in the dark like some creature that fears the sun. Only a fool burrows into rock when God gave us timber, my friends. Only a fool trades honest American daylight for a Scottish cave-dweller's madness." The laughter grew louder. Someone near the front, Sawyer did not see who, shouted out, "The Mole Man!" and the name was taken up by others, repeated with the delight of people who have found a new entertainment at someone else's expense. Sawyer did not move. He did not speak. He watched Jessup accept the crowd's approval with a modest bow, watched the mayor's wife, Cordelia, smile her tight, satisfied smile, watched the faces of men and women who had been cordial enough to him the day before now turn away as though he carried some contagion. When the laughter finally died and the crowd began to disperse toward the tables of food, Sawyer turned and walked back toward his horse without a word. He did not attend the evening fireworks. He was not expected. The social exclusion that followed was organized with the efficiency of a military campaign, and Cordelia Jessup was its commanding general. She was a thin woman with sharp features and sharper opinions, and she had decided that Sawyer Wainwright was not the sort of person who belonged in respectable Deerfield society. Within a week of her husband's speech, Sawyer found himself excluded from the Merchant Association meetings he had occasionally attended. His name was removed from the list of approved vendors for the church's autumn festival. The seamstress who had been altering his shirts suddenly discovered that she was too busy to take his work. The barber suggested with elaborate politeness that perhaps Sawyer might prefer to shave himself. If you want to see how completely one determined woman can reshape a community's behavior, check out the Social Dynamics playlist on this channel. The link is in the description, and some of those patterns will look surprisingly familiar. The whispers followed him down Main Street whenever he rode in for supplies. Women gathered in doorways fell silent as he passed, their conversations resuming in lower tones once he was beyond earshot. Men who had once nodded greetings now looked through him as though he were made of glass. Children pointed and giggled, having learned from their parents that the foreign man with the strange accent was someone to mock rather than respect. At Harrigan's Mercantile, where Sawyer purchased his blasting supplies and rope and the heavy canvas he used to cover his equipment, the owner, Thomas Harrigan, remained cordial but careful. Harrigan was a businessman first and a social creature second, and he would not turn away a paying customer, but he made certain never to engage Sawyer in prolonged conversation when other customers were present. Their transactions became brief and businesslike, coins exchanged for goods with barely a word beyond what was necessary. Sawyer purchased another 100 feet of hemp rope that October, adding to the 200 feet he already had coiled in his cave workshop. Harrigan raised an eyebrow at the quantity. "Planning to tie down the territory?" the merchant asked, and then glanced toward the door as though checking to see if anyone had witnessed him making friendly conversation with the mole man. "Planning to survive it," Sawyer replied. He did not explain further. He had learned, in the months since Jessup's speech, that explanation was wasted on people who had already decided what they believed. He paid for his rope, loaded it onto the pack frame behind Moira's saddle, and rode back to his Granite home without looking at the faces that watched him go. The cave workshop was nearly complete by then, and Sawyer spent the shortening days of autumn finishing the details that would make it not just a shelter, but a fortress against whatever winter chose to send. He built wooden racks along the interior walls for storing tools and provisions. He constructed a sleeping platform of heavy timber, raised 18 inches off the stone floor to keep him above the cold that would settle in the lowest part of the chamber. He hung canvas curtains that could be drawn across the entrance vestibule, creating an airlock that would trap heat inside even when the outer door was opened. The forge itself was his masterpiece, though no one but him would ever see it as such. He had built the fire pit against the back wall where the granite was thickest, lining it with fire brick he had purchased at considerable expense from a supplier in Helena. The chimney drew perfectly through the natural fissure he had widened, carrying smoke upward and out while the heat radiated into the surrounding stone. On the coldest nights, he could let his fire burn low and still feel warmth emanating from the rock walls that had absorbed hours of heat during the day. He built iron brackets and drilled holes into the granite at regular intervals, creating anchor points for the ropes he would string when the time came. He calculated distances and drew maps in a leather journal, planning the network of lifelines that would connect every building in Deerfield to every other building, creating paths that a man could follow blind through the worst blizzard. He did not know if the town would ever need such a network. He knew only that his grandmother had taught him to build one, and that she had never been wrong about winter. The warning signs began appearing in late October, for those with eyes to see them. Sawyer rode out to the foothills one morning and found elk moving south in numbers he had never witnessed before. Their coats grown thick and dark with winter fur that seemed heavier than any he had seen in his 3 years in Montana. The great bulls, usually solitary this time of year, traveled with the herds as though some instinct had told them that separation meant death. Their breath steamed in the cold morning air, and their eyes rolled toward the northern horizon as though they could see something there that human eyes could not perceive. He mentioned this to Harrigan the next time he came to town for supplies. The merchant shrugged. "Elk move," Harrigan said. "They have been moving since before men came to this country. It means nothing." "They are 3 weeks early," Sawyer said. "Their coats are thicker than I have ever seen, and they are afraid." Harrigan made a sound that might have been a laugh. "The mole man reads minds now? Animal minds?" He glanced at another customer who had entered the store, a farmer named Wilkins who stood examining axe handles with elaborate attention. "Montana winters come and go like any other. We have survived them all." Sawyer did not argue. He had learned that arguing accomplished nothing. He purchased extra coal oil, additional candles, and 3 more bags of cornmeal, and he carried them back to his cave without another word. But the signs continued. The birds fell silent earlier than they should have. The songbirds and jays and crows that usually filled the autumn air with their noise simply vanishing overnight as though they had received some message that humans could not hear. The horses in town stood differently, their rumps turned perpetually to the north, their ears flicking backward toward sounds that no human detected. Even the domestic animals seemed restless. Hens stopped laying. Pigs rooted frantically at the frozen earth as though searching for something they could not find. Sawyer watched all of this from his Granite home, and he prepared. He strung test lines between his workshop and the nearest fence post, measuring the rope tension that would hold against wind, calculating the knot strength that would bear a man's weight if he had to pull himself hand over hand through a blizzard. He filled every container he owned with water, knowing that the creek would freeze solid if temperatures dropped far enough. He stacked cordwood in the vestibule until he could barely squeeze past it, and he calculated that 4 tons of coal would burn for 63 days if he rationed it carefully. 63 days. It seemed like an absurd number, the paranoid calculation of a man who had given in to fear. And yet his grandmother had told him stories of winter storms that lasted longer. On the evening of November 28th, with the first true cold of the season settling over the prairie, Sawyer walked out to where Moira stood in the small paddock he had built against the sheltered southern face of the granite outcropping. The mare lifted her head at his approach, her breath forming clouds in the still air, her winter coat already grown thick and woolly. She was the best horse he had ever owned, steady and patient and wise in the way that some horses became wise, and she had carried him across a continent without complaint. He leaned against her warm neck and spoke to her the way he had spoken to her 1,000 times before, in the quiet voice he used when no other human was present. "They will not believe until the storm comes," he said, "and by then it will be too late to prepare. They will freeze in their wooden houses, Moira. They will lose their way walking between buildings they have walked between all their lives. They will run out of food because they did not think to store enough, and they will run out of fuel because they burned it all in the first week trying to stay warm." The mare turned her head and regarded him with one dark eye. "And when they are cold and starving and lost, they will come to me. They will come to the mole man in his cave, because his cave will be the only warm place left. Sawyer was quiet for a moment, stroking the mare's neck. I will help them when they come. My grandmother would expect nothing less, but I will not forget how they laughed. Moira nickered softly, and Sawyer smiled without humor. Let them talk, he said. The snow will teach them what I cannot. He led the mare into the small stable he had built for her, a sturdy structure of heavy logs with a roof sloped steep enough to shed any accumulation. The walls were thick, the gaps filled with clay and horsehair, the floor covered with deep straw that she could burrow into for warmth. He had spent nearly as much time building Moira's shelter as he had spent on his own living quarters, because his grandmother had taught him that a man who did not care for his animals in winter would find himself without animals in spring. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees that night, and Sawyer lay on his sleeping platform in the granite chamber, listening to the wind rise outside. The stone walls held their steady 52 degrees, neither warm nor cold, simply constant. The fire in his forge burned low, needing only occasional attention to maintain the chamber's comfort. Above his head, 40 feet of solid granite shielded him from whatever fury the sky chose to unleash. He thought about Cordelia Jessup and her quilting circles, her pointed exclusions, her careful campaign to make him a pariah. He thought about Mayor Jessup and his speech, his laughter, his certainty that he understood what Deerfield needed. He thought about the faces that turned away from him on Main Street, the whispers that followed him, the children who called him Mole Man and threw pebbles when they thought he was not looking. And he thought about his grandmother, her frozen hands still wrapped around the rope that had saved his life, her last act on earth an act of protection for the boy she had raised since his parents died of fever when he was 3 years old. He had not come to Deerfield to be loved. He had come to survive. And when the storm came, when the siege began, he would be ready. If you want to see the full breakdown of how that cave workshop was built, stone by stone, the construction videos on this channel go deep into historical techniques. Link in the description. The false calm came on December 1st, 2 days before the world ended. The sky cleared to a brilliant blue that seemed almost artificial in its perfection, and the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in a week. Citizens of Deerfield emerged from their homes blinking in the unexpected sunshine, speaking cheerfully about mild winters and Indian summers and the way that Montana always found a way to surprise. The mayor held court on the steps of his hotel, assuring anyone who would listen that the worst was clearly past, that his faith in Providence had been justified, that the coming season would be remembered for its gentleness rather than its severity. Sawyer watched the celebration from his granite doorway, a half-mile distant, and he saw what they did not see. The northern horizon had developed a quality that defied description, a darkness that was not cloud and not shadow, but something older and more patient. The air tasted different, carrying a metallic edge that reminded him of blood or iron. The horses in town had not relaxed despite the warmer temperature. They still stood with their rumps to the north, still watched the sky with rolling eyes, still refused to eat with the appetite that warm weather should have restored. He checked his provisions one more time. 4 tons of coal, 300 feet of rope, iron stakes for anchoring lines in frozen ground, enough cornmeal and salt pork and dried beans to feed several people for 2 months, water stored in every container he owned, candles by the gross, oil for lamps, blankets, medicine, bandages, everything his grandmother had taught him to keep, everything the crofters of Skye had learned through generations of winter death and winter survival. On the morning of December 3, 1887, Sawyer woke before dawn to a sound he recognized in his bones. The wind had found its voice. The wind had found its voice. It began as a moan, low and sustained, the sound of something vast drawing breath before speaking. Within an hour, that moan had risen to a howl, and by noon the howl had become a scream that did not pause for air, did not falter for even a moment, simply sustained itself at a pitch that made conversation impossible and thought difficult. Sawyer had heard winter storms in the Scottish Highlands. He had weathered gales on the North Atlantic that sent waves crashing over the deck of the Caledonia. He had survived 28 years of winters in lands where winter was a serious thing, a killing thing, a force that demanded respect. He'd never heard anything like this. The temperature dropped so fast he could watch his breath thicken in the air, could see the moisture on his stone walls crystallize into frost patterns that spread like living things. By mid-afternoon, the thermometer he had mounted outside his entrance read 4 degrees below zero and falling. By nightfall, it had stopped moving at 23 below, not because the cold had stopped, but because the mercury had frozen solid in the glass. The wind did not blow in gusts. It did not rise and fall like normal weather. It simply pressed against the world with a constant, implacable force, driving snow horizontally across the landscape with such velocity that individual flakes became weapons, tiny razors of ice that could strip exposed skin raw in minutes. From his granite doorway, Sawyer could not see the town. He could not see beyond 10 feet. The world had become a wall of white fury, and somewhere beyond that wall, 847 souls were learning what Montana winters could truly be. The stone around him held steady. The chimney drew cleanly through its natural fissures, the external vents designed to face away from prevailing winds. His fire burned without struggle, feeding air through the intake shaft he had carved on the sheltered side of the outcropping. The coal bin sat full. The provisions remained stacked in their careful rows. The temperature inside his chamber held at 52 degrees, exactly as the granite had held it through every season since he had finished the excavation. He thought about going into town. He thought about the faces that had turned away from him, the whispers that had followed him, the children who had thrown pebbles and called him names. He thought about Cordelia Jessup organizing her quilting circles to exclude him, about Mayor Jessup standing on the steps of his hotel, declaring that only a fool burrows into rock when God gave us timber. And then he thought about his grandmother, her frozen hands still wrapped around the rope, her body going still in the gray morning light 3 days out from New York Harbor. He had 300 feet of hemp line. He had iron stakes that could be driven into frozen ground. He had everything he needed to begin building a lifeline network between the structures of Deerfield, connecting building to building so that people could find their way through conditions where direction ceased to exist. But he could not string ropes in this wind. Not yet. Not while the storm was still finding its strength. To go out now would be to die, and a dead man saved no one. So Sawyer waited. He tended his fire. He checked his provisions. He listened to the wind scream its fury against 40 feet of solid granite, and he waited for the moment when the storm would pause long enough to let him work. That moment did not come for 9 days. The White Siege, as the survivors would later call it, did not relent. It did not weaken. It did not offer the brief calms that even severe storms usually provided. For 9 consecutive days, the wind maintained its killing pressure. The temperature held below 20 degrees, and the snow fell with such density that it buried the lower floors of buildings and drifted against walls in sculpted formations that reached second-story windows. On the 4th day, Sawyer heard a sound that cut through the wind. It was a sound he recognized from the stories his grandmother had told, the sound of large timber splintering under impossible weight. Somewhere in the white fury beyond his doorway, a building was dying. He could not see it. He could not reach it. He could only listen as the groaning and cracking continued for several minutes, followed by a crash that shook the ground beneath his feet. Later, he would learn it was the north wall of the Jessup Hotel, torn away by wind that had found purchase beneath the eaves and lifted the entire section of roof like a man lifting a hat. The three-story structure that Mayor Jessup had built with such pride, the tallest building in Deerfield, the symbol of his importance and his vision for the town's future, had lost a third of its mass in a single, catastrophic moment. The guests inside had scrambled to the remaining sections, huddling together in rooms that were no longer properly insulated, sharing body heat as the temperature inside dropped toward the temperature outside. On the fifth day, old Marcus Pruitt froze to death in his cabin on the edge of town. Marcus was 73 years old, a widower who had come to Montana to spend his final years in what he called God's country. He had survived the war between the states, had survived smallpox and cholera and a Comanche raid that left him with a scar across his scalp where a warrior had tried to take his hair. He had outlived 2 wives and 4 children and had told anyone who would listen that he intended to outlive Montana itself. His stove ran out of fuel on the morning of the 5th day. His woodpile, which had seemed so adequate in November, had been buried under 8 feet of drifted snow. He could not reach it. He could not dig through the frozen mass that blocked his door. He sat in his rocking chair, wrapped in every blanket he owned, and he simply stopped. The cold took him gently, the way cold takes the old and the tired and the ready. When they found him in February, his face held an expression of peace, as though he had seen something worth seeing in those final moments. On the 7th day, Clara Fenwick died. Clara was 7 years old, the youngest daughter of the Fenwick family who ran the laundry on 3rd Street. She had wanted to check on her rabbit, a gray and white creature named Patches who lived in a hutch behind the barn. The barn was 20 feet from the house, 20 feet of open ground that should have taken 10 seconds to cross. Clara's mother watched her daughter step out the back door, watched the white wall of snow swallow her completely, watched the small figure vanish as though it had never existed. She screamed her daughter's name. She tied a rope around her own waist and tried to follow. She found nothing. The wind had erased all trace of direction, all sense of distance, all hope of finding anything in that howling white void. They found Clara in February, curled against the barn wall. She had made it most of the way. She had died within arm's reach of shelter, unable to see it through the snow, unable to feel which direction to crawl. The rabbit had frozen too, still in its hutch, still waiting for the little girl who had loved it. These details reached Sawyer later, pieced together from survivors who would tell their stories in voices that trembled with remembered horror. In the moment, he knew only that people were dying out there in the white, dying in ways that his grandmother had described, dying the deaths of those who had not prepared for what winter could become. On the 8th day, Elton Greaves suffocated in his blacksmith shop. Elton had been the town's smith before Sawyer arrived, a competent craftsman who had welcomed the younger man's presence as a chance to reduce his own workload. He was 61 years old, slower than he had been, happy to let Sawyer take the more demanding work while he focused on repairs and simple forging. His shop stood on Main Street, a wooden structure with a brick chimney that rose 12 feet above the roofline. The snow had buried that chimney by the morning of the 8th day. Elton did not notice at first, too focused on keeping his fire burning, too grateful for the warmth to wonder why the shop was filling with smoke. By the time he understood what was happening, the carbon monoxide had already clouded his thinking. He tried to reach the door. He collapsed 3 feet short of it. Harrigan found him 2 days later, having dug a tunnel through the snow that blocked the mercantile's entrance. The shopkeeper had been trying to reach other buildings, trying to establish some connection with the rest of the town. He found only Elton's body, still warm from the forge that had burned for hours after its master stopped breathing. The mayor's livery collapsed on the 9th day. 8 horses died in that collapse, including 2 that Thaddeus Jessup had imported from Kentucky at considerable expense, animals he had boasted about at every opportunity, creatures he had called the finest horseflesh in the territory. The weight of snow on the roof had exceeded anything the structure was designed to bear, and the building had simply pancaked inward, crushing everything beneath it. Sawyer heard that collapse, too. He had learned to identify buildings by the sounds of their deaths, the different timbres of destruction that different structures produced. This one was accompanied by the screaming of horses, a sound that cut through the wind with terrible clarity, a sound that lasted for several minutes before finally falling silent. Through all of this, Sawyer's cave held steady. The granite did not crack. The chimney did not clog. The coal burned clean and warm, and the provisions remained stacked in their careful rows, and Moira stood in her underground stable with hay in her manger and water in her trough in the confused patience of an animal who did not understand why the world had gone mad, but trusted her human to keep her safe. On the morning of the 10th day, the wind finally paused. It did not stop. The storm was not over. But for perhaps 6 hours, the sustained fury dropped to something merely severe, something that allowed a man to see perhaps 50 feet ahead, something that permitted movement if that movement was careful and that man was prepared. Sawyer had been waiting for this moment for 9 days. He dressed in every layer he owned. He wrapped his face in wool until only his eyes remained exposed. He took his hammer, his iron stakes, and 100 feet of hemp rope coiled over his shoulder. He stepped out of his granite doorway into a world transformed by violence. The landscape he knew had vanished beneath sculpted dunes of white, curved and shaped by wind into formations that bore no relationship to the terrain beneath. The road to town had disappeared. The fences had disappeared. Even the trees had become unrecognizable, bent and buried and coated in ice until they looked like the bones of strange creatures frozen in postures of agony. He began driving stakes into the frozen ground, anchoring his rope at intervals of 20 feet, creating a line that led from his cave toward the town. The work was brutal. The ground had frozen to a depth that required all his strength to penetrate. His hands grew numb despite his gloves. His face burned where the wind found gaps in his wrapping. But he had done this work before. His grandmother had taught him how to drive stakes in frozen earth, how to tie knots that would not slip, how to create a lifeline that could guide the lost back to safety. He had practiced these skills in the hills of Skye, in conditions that the crofters considered merely difficult. This was harder. This was Montana in full fury. But the skills remained. By mid-afternoon, he had reached the first outlying structures of Deerfield, and he began connecting buildings. The rope ran at waist height, high enough to remain above all but the deepest drifts, low enough to be grasped by a walking person. He tied it to porch posts and door frames and anything else that seemed solid enough to hold. He worked his way toward Main Street, toward the heart of the town, toward the places where people would be gathered. He found the first survivors in the Methodist Church. They had gathered there on the 3rd day, perhaps 60 people who had managed to reach the building before the storm made movement impossible. They had been trapped ever since, burning pews for warmth, rationing the small supply of food that the minister's wife had brought from the parsonage. They stared at Sawyer as he pushed open the door, stared at the rope that trailed behind him into the white void, stared as though they were seeing a ghost or an angel or something else that did not belong to the world they knew. Sarah Colton reached him first. She was the minister's wife, a woman of perhaps 40 years, with gray streaking her brown hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and prayer and sleepless nights. She had organized the survivors in the church, had rationed the food, had led prayers that she was not certain God was hearing. She looked at the rope in Sawyer's hand, and her face crumpled with something that was not quite hope and not quite despair, but something between. "We thought everyone was dead," she said. "We thought the whole town was gone." "Not everyone," Sawyer said, "and not gone. But you cannot stay here. The coal in my forge will burn for another 6 weeks. The food I have stored will feed twice this many people. The cave holds steady at 52 degrees. You need to come with me." She looked at the rope again. She looked at the white fury beyond the church windows. She looked at the faces of the survivors who had gathered behind her, the frightened children and the exhausted adults and the old people who had begun to accept that they might die in this building. "Show us the way," she said. "If you want to see how lifeline rope systems actually saved lives in frontier winters, this channel covers the real history behind techniques like these. Check the link in the description." Sawyer organized them into groups of 10, each group holding the rope with both hands, each person connected to the person ahead and the person behind. He led the first group himself, walking slowly through the white, following the line he had strung that morning. The journey that should have taken 5 minutes took nearly an hour. Children stumbled. Adults fell. The cold found every gap in their clothing and punished every moment of exposure. But the rope held. The stakes held. The knowledge that his grandmother had given him, the skills she had taught him in the hills of Skye, the wisdom that crofters had accumulated through generations of winter survival, all of it held. He brought them to the cave in groups, settling them in the main chamber where the forge's heat spread evenly through the granite space. He gave them warm food and hot water and blankets from his stores. He watched their faces as they realized what he had built, watched them look at the stacked provisions and the steady fire and the stone walls that held the cold at bay. None of them spoke of mole men. None of them spoke of cave dwellers' madness. The storm did not end that day, nor the next. For another 3 weeks the wind continued its assault, though the worst of its fury had broken against the mountains and exhausted itself in the assault on Deerfield. Sawyer made 7 more trips to the town during the brief lulls that punctuated the blizzard's final gasps, each time bringing back more survivors, each time stringing more rope to connect more buildings to the network that radiated from his granite sanctuary. The final count, when the skies finally cleared and the survivors could take stock of what remained, was 412 souls saved. 435 had perished. Among the dead were Clara Fenwick, who had died seeking her rabbit; Marcus Pruitt, who had frozen when his stove ran dry; Elton Greaves, who had suffocated in his own smoke. 23 others had died in collapsed buildings. Dozens more had simply frozen where they sat, unable to reach help, unwilling to venture into the white void that had swallowed their world. Inside the cave, Sawyer organized the survivors with the same methodical patience he had applied to carving the granite itself. He divided the chamber into sections, assigning families to specific areas, establishing schedules for cooking and sleeping, and the careful rationing of provisions. The coal burned steadily, doled out by the bucketful rather than the shovelful, keeping the temperature comfortable without wasting fuel that might be needed if the storm lasted longer than anyone expected. Sarah Colton became his lieutenant in these efforts, her organizational skills complementing his practical knowledge. She managed the human needs while he managed the material ones, and between them they created a system that kept 400 people alive in a space designed for one. The children adapted fastest. Within days, they were playing games in the corners of the cave, their laughter echoing strangely off the stone walls. The adults took longer to adjust. Many of them had lost homes, businesses, livestock, everything they had built in their years in Deerfield. They sat against the granite walls and stared at nothing, processing grief that they did not yet have words to express. Sawyer taught as he worked. He showed the men how to splice rope, how to tie knots that would hold under strain, how to drive stakes into frozen ground without splitting the wood. He demonstrated the principles that had guided his construction of the cave, explaining how the mass of the granite absorbed and released heat, how the L-shaped vestibule broke the wind's force, how the chimney's angle prevented downdrafts from choking the forge. He did not lecture. He simply worked, and those who wished to learn watched, and those who wished to help were given tasks within their abilities. This is exactly the kind of practical survival knowledge that got lost between generations. If you want to see more stories about people who preserved these skills when their communities forgot them, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The provisions held. Sawyer had planned for 60 days of solitary survival, and feeding 400 people for 3 weeks stretched those supplies dangerously thin. But he had also planned for contingencies. The dried meat and hardtack and preserved vegetables that he had stored proved sufficient, supplemented by the supplies that survivors had managed to carry from the church and the few other buildings that had remained accessible. By the time the storm finally broke, on the 3rd of January in the year 1888, the shelves were nearly bare, but no one had starved. Mayor Thaddeus Jessup had been among the survivors in the church. He had arrived there on the 4th day of the storm, having abandoned his hotel when the north wall began to buckle. He had been wearing a nightshirt and a hastily grabbed coat, having fled with nothing but his life and his wife on his arm. For 3 weeks, he had lived in the corner of Sawyer's cave, eating food that Sawyer had stored, warming himself at Sawyer's forge, sleeping beneath blankets that Sawyer had purchased with money earned from honest labor. He did not speak to Sawyer during those 3 weeks. He did not meet his eyes. He sat in his corner and stared at the stone walls and said nothing. When the storm finally ended and the survivors began the slow process of emerging into a world transformed, the work of rebuilding began. The snow lay 8 feet deep across the prairie, and the buildings that remained standing were damaged beyond easy repair. Deerfield, as it had existed before the 3rd of December, was gone. What would rise in its place would be something different, something shaped by the lessons that the winter had taught. The gathering came in February. It was Sarah Colton who organized it, working with the minister and the few remaining civic leaders to bring the survivors together in the Methodist Church, which had been cleared and repaired sufficiently to serve its original purpose once more. The pews that had been burned for warmth had been replaced with rough benches, and the windows that had cracked in the cold had been boarded over. But the space was functional, and the people of Deerfield needed a place to come together. They needed to speak. Sawyer almost did not attend. He had returned to his cave when the storm ended, had resumed his work at the forge, had begun the slow process of restocking his provisions for the next winter. He had no interest in speeches or ceremonies or the public processing of grief. But Sarah Colton came to him on the morning of the gathering, her boots crunching through the crusted snow, her breath steaming in air that was still cold but no longer killing. "They need to say things," she said, "and you need to hear them. I do not need anything from them. Perhaps not, but they need something from you. And I believe your grandmother would have understood that survival is not only about the body." Sawyer looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his hammer and reached for his coat. The church was full when he arrived. Every surviving citizen of Deerfield had gathered, filling the benches and standing along the walls and crowding into the vestibule. They fell silent when Sawyer entered, parting to let him pass, watching him with eyes that held something he had never seen directed at him before. He took a seat near the back, but Sarah Colton shook her head and gestured toward the front. He did not argue. He walked to the front pew and sat down, alone, facing the altar where the minister stood with his hands clasped. "We have come together," the minister said, "to give thanks for our deliverance and to speak truths that must be spoken. The storm tested us. Many of us were found wanting. But we survived, and we did so because one among us had prepared when the rest of us had not. I believe there are those here who wish to address that man directly." Thaddeus Jessup rose from his seat. The mayor had aged a decade in 2 months. His hair, which had been merely graying before the storm, was now white. His face, which had been florid and confident, was drawn and pale. He walked to the front of the church with the slow steps of a man approaching a gallows, and when he turned to face the congregation, his hands were trembling. "I called him the Mole Man," Jessup said, his voice cracking on the words. "On Independence Day, in front of everyone, I said that only a fool burrows into rock when God gave us timber. I said he had traded honest American daylight for a Scottish cave-dweller's madness. I laughed, and I made sure others laughed with me." He paused, swallowing hard. The church was utterly silent. When the north wall of my hotel fell in, I thought I was going to die. I could hear the wind tearing at what remained, and I knew the rest of the building would follow. My wife and I had nothing but night clothes. We had stored nothing, prepared nothing, assumed that Deerfield's winters would be like every winter before. We ran through the storm in bare feet, and I still cannot feel 3 of my toes, and the doctor says I never will again. His voice broke entirely. He stood for a moment with his head bowed, composing himself. The rope he had strung led us to the church. Without that rope, we would have died in the snow, lost and frozen, 10 feet from salvation and unable to see it. And when he came to the church, when he led us to his cave, he gave us warmth and food and shelter without asking for anything in return. He saved my life. He saved my wife's life. He saved every person in this room, and I mocked him for the very preparations that made that salvation possible. Thaddeus Jessup turned to face Sawyer directly. There were tears on his cheeks, freezing in the cold air of the church. "I am asking if you can find it in yourself to forgive a proud and foolish man who did not deserve your mercy but received it anyway." He stood there, waiting. The congregation waited. The minister waited. And Sawyer sat in his pew and said nothing. Cordelia Jessup rose next. She was thinner than she had been before the storm, her sharp features sharpened further by weeks of rationed food. "I organized the quilting circle to exclude you," she said, her voice high and brittle. "I told the other women that we could not be seen associating with a man who lived like a badger in a hole. I said that decent Christian folk should not encourage such peculiar behavior. I was protecting the reputation of our community, I told myself. I was maintaining standards." She laughed, a harsh and bitter sound. "When the livery collapsed, I heard our horses screaming. Those were the horses my husband had spent a fortune importing from Kentucky, the horses I had bragged about at every social gathering, the horses that were supposed to prove how successful and sophisticated we were. They died in the cold because we had built their stable from wood and vanity instead of from stone and sense. And I huddled in your cave eating your food, warming myself at your fire, and I thought about every invitation I had made certain you would never receive." She turned to face him. "I was wrong, and I am ashamed, and I am asking if you can forgive me for cruelty that served no purpose but my own pride." Thomas Harrigan rose third. The shopkeeper had lost everything in the storm. His mercantile collapsed under the weight of snow, his inventory buried and ruined. "I sold you supplies for 3 years, he said. "Rope and powder and tools and provisions. I took your money and filled your orders and never once invited you to dinner. I told myself I was simply being prudent, that a man who carved a cave into solid rock was not the sort of man whose company I should cultivate. I knew you were preparing for something. I sold you the very materials that proved you right, and still I stood aside when others mocked you, because it was easier to belong with the crowd than to stand alone with the truth." He spread his hands, a gesture of helplessness. "My store is gone. My stock is gone. Everything I built in 15 years of work is buried under 8 feet of snow. And your cave still stands, and your provisions fed my family when I had nothing to feed them with. I am asking your forgiveness for cowardice dressed up as propriety." 3 more citizens rose to speak. A farmer who had joined in the laughter at the Independence Day gathering. a woman who had crossed the street to avoid walking near the mole man's cave, a young man who had thrown stones at Sawyer's mare as a boy and never been corrected by his parents. Each of them confessed what they had done. Each of them described what they had suffered. Each of them acknowledged that Sawyer's preparations had saved their lives. Each of them asked for forgiveness. Through all of it, Sawyer sat in his pew and listened. His face betrayed nothing. His hands rested on his knees, still and patient. When the last confessor had returned to their seat, the minister looked at him expectantly. "Mr. Wainwright, if you wish to respond, the congregation will hear you." Sawyer rose. He walked to the front of the church and stood where the confessors had stood, facing the people who had mocked him and shunned him, and now looked to him with desperate hope. "My grandmother told me that pride freezes faster than flesh," he said. His voice was steady, neither harsh nor warm. "She said it to me when I was a boy, after a storm in the hills of Skye that killed 3 men who had refused to tie lifelines because they believed they knew the paths well enough to walk them blind. They were not bad men. They were not fools. They were simply proud, and pride made them trust themselves when they should have trusted the rope." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. "She died with frozen hands wrapped around the line that kept me alive. She was proud, too, in her way. Proud of her knowledge, proud of her skills, proud of the traditions that her father and his father before him had passed down through generations of crofters who learned that the winter does not care about pride. But her pride served others. Her pride drove her to prepare, to teach, to build, to tie the ropes that guided the lost back home. That is the only kind of pride worth keeping." His gaze moved across the congregation, resting briefly on Thaddeus Jessup, on Cordelia, on Harrigan. "You ask me for forgiveness. You want me to say that what you did is washed away, that we can begin again as though the mocking and the shunning never happened. But I am not the one who was harmed by your pride. Clara Fenwick died 20 feet from her door because no one had tied a rope she could follow. Marcus Pruitt froze because no one had stored enough fuel to share. Elton Greaves suffocated because no one had thought to build a chimney that could not clog. I survived. They did not, and it is not my place to forgive offenses committed against the dead." For people interested in how communities rebuilt after disasters like this, there is a great documentary about frontier recovery efforts linked in the description below. The silence in the church was absolute. Sawyer let it stretch. "What I can tell you," he said finally, "is that forgiveness is not what you need. You do not need me to say words that make you feel better about what you did. You need to learn. You need to build. You need to become the kind of people who prepare rather than mock those who prepare. You need to tie the ropes and store the provisions and carve the shelters that will keep your children alive when the next storm comes. Because there will be another storm. There is always another storm." He looked at them, and his winter slate eyes held neither anger nor warmth, only the patient steadiness of a man who had learned his lessons early and well. "I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. That is what my grandmother would have done. That is what her father did, and his father before him. The knowledge does not belong to me. It belongs to anyone willing to receive it. If you want forgiveness, forgive yourselves by becoming people who will never need to ask for it again." He returned to his pew. He sat down. He said nothing more. The gathering ended in silence. People filed out of the church without speaking, many of them in tears, all of them carrying something heavier than they had brought in. But in the days that followed, they began to come to Sawyer's cave. They came alone, and in pairs, and in small groups. They came with questions and notebooks, and the humble willingness of students who knew they had much to learn. Sawyer taught them all. The rebuilding of Deerfield took 3 years. The new buildings were different from the old ones, lower and sturdier, with steep roofs designed to shed snow rather than bear it. Several families built their homes against the granite outcropping that Sawyer had first recognized as valuable, carving into the rock or using it as a natural windbreak. A network of ropes connected every major building in town, maintained year-round, inspected monthly by volunteers who had been trained by the Scottish blacksmith who had saved them all. Thaddeus Jessup never held public office again. He spent the remainder of his life as a quiet man, working as a clerk in the new mercantile that Thomas Harrigan built against the lee of a natural stone formation. But every winter, when the storms began to howl, he could be found checking the rope lines, ensuring that every knot was tight, every stake secure. He never missed a day of that work until he died, 20 years after the storm at the age of 73. The term mole man did not disappear, but its meaning transformed entirely. Within a decade, calling someone a mole man in Montana meant calling them prudent, prepared, practical. It meant they built with stone when others built with wood, stored provisions when others assumed tomorrow would be like today, tied ropes when others trusted their luck. Young men boasted of being mole men. Fathers taught their sons to take pride in the name. Sawyer married Sarah Colton's youngest daughter, a woman named Elizabeth who had been 19 during the storm and who had watched him organize the salvation of her community with the patient competence that she would come to love. They had 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood, all of whom learned the skills their father had learned from his grandmother on a wind-scoured island across the sea. Moira, the strawberry roan mare who had carried Sawyer across a continent, died in the spring of 1894 at the age of 22. Sawyer buried her on the hillside above his cave with a stone marker that bore her name and the years of her life and nothing more. He never rode another horse. He said that she had been his last companion from the old country, and that some companions could not be replaced. If this story resonated with you, you might also enjoy our video about the historical figures who kept traditional survival skills alive. I will leave that linked at the end of this one. 40 years after the White Siege, 17 granite-sheltered forges dotted Montana territory, all of them built by men and women whom Sawyer had taught. Each of them maintained the rope networks that their teacher had introduced, lines of hemp and later steel cable that connected buildings and guided the lost and saved lives every winter. The builders of these forges called their lifelines Wainwright ropes, and they taught the technique to their own apprentices, who taught it to theirs, who carried the knowledge forward into a future that Sawyer himself would never see. He died in the winter of 1923 at the age of 81, in the granite chamber that he had carved with his own hands 39 years before. Elizabeth had passed 2 years earlier, and his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren had gathered for what they knew would be the end. He asked them to carry him to the entrance of the cave, where he could see the prairie stretching out toward the mountains, white with fresh snow, gleaming in the winter sun. "It is not so different from Skye," he said, though none of those gathered had ever seen that distant island. "The cold is the same. The wind is the same. The stone endures." He died with his hand resting on the hemp rope that his grandmother had been holding when her heart stopped on a ship in the North Atlantic, 67 years before. His children found the rope coiled in his workshop, worn smooth by decades of handling, preserved with the same care that Sawyer had given to every tool and technique that connected him to the woman who had taught him everything worth knowing. They buried him beside Moira, on the hillside above the cave, where he could watch over the town that had mocked him, and then learned from him and finally honored him as the founder of something that would outlast them all. The cave workshop still stands. The granite face that Sawyer recognized as valuable on a spring day in 1884 has not changed in the century and more since he first pressed his palm against its surface. The forge is cold now, the coal bin empty, the provisions long since consumed, But the chamber itself remains exactly as he built it, 40 feet deep and 20 wide, with walls smoothed by hammer and chisel, and a chimney that still draws clean through natural fissures in the rock. Visitors come there still, in all seasons. They run their hands along the stone walls and try to imagine the months of labor that created this space. The vision that saw shelter where others saw only worthless rock. The patience that transformed that vision into reality one hammer blow at a time. Above the entrance, carved in letters that Sawyer cut with his own hands in the final year of his life, visitors find an inscription that has been reproduced in granite shelter workshops across 3 states. The earth endures. Build with her. Moira would have recognized the words. They were the last she spoke to her grandson before the wave came through the hatch, before the cold stopped her heart, before her frozen hands closed around the rope that would keep him alive to hear them, and remember them, and carve them into stone that would hold them forever.